I've been making videos for over 14 years, and while some of that stuff is pretty cringeworthy to go back and watch, there was a certain freedom that I felt making it. There was no SEO, no marketing, and no trying to game the algorithm. It just felt like I was making stuff because I wanted to. And I don't think social media has helped with that because there's kind of been this shift from self expression over to self promotion. As a creative with a ton of interests, I started to feel like the internet was becoming more draining than it was energizing. And it became more and more difficult to find artists and communities that were actually inspiring. A couple years ago, I came across the term digital gardening, and it started to change the way that I track my ideas, that I write, and generally just the way that I think and express myself. If you're not familiar, a digital garden is essentially the opposite of a blog. A blog is kind of tracking the more polished, finished ideas. You might take a couple days, weeks, months, however long to iterate until you feel like it's good enough to share with the rest of the world. Whereas a digital garden kind of flips that on its head and says, why don't we show all of the work in progress and see where that path takes us? There's a lot of branches of digital gardening, which we'll get into from second brain to atomic note taking. But the general idea is that you start to share the scraps of your work and slowly piece things together in public. And it's not about just hitting publish on the first idea you have, it's about lowering the pressure so that you can see where your note taking and your ideas go. Over time, you'll start to see these different patterns develop, and you kind of get a visual map of your thinking. There's so many different ways you can express this too, and some people kind of take this to the max. There's some really cool examples that I'll share, but the general idea is that you have a safe place you feel you can express yourself, whether it's in writing or in music, graphic design, whatever your medium is. You're not trying to compete with everyone else. This is just for you. So here are 5 reasons I think you need a digital garden. Number 1, it gives your messy ideas a home. I'm sure we all have our Scratch notepad, whether that's in Apple Notes or a physical notebook, but you have some space, hopefully, where you're just jotting down ideas and you're trying to capture them. But the problem is, you end up with more and more of these kind of half formulated thoughts that probably do have a lot of value in them, but it takes time to kind of hone those ideas and separate that from the rest that actually might just be junk. As a software designer in the age of AI, things are constantly changing and it can feel very claustrophobic sometimes to try and keep up with it all. And so, a digital garden for me has allowed me to capture things that stand out to me that might spark some sort of intrigue. And I can kind of bookmark that for later, but then come back to it and start to write and build my own notes and thoughts off of that. If all of this was happening in one place, it becomes really tough to discern kind of the maturity level of your notes. If everything's just in the same list, it's hard to figure out what stands out as this is kind of evergreen or this is something actionable that you can come back to at work later. So having a digital garden fits really nicely between a Scratch notepad and fully finished projects, something like this video. Number 2, it lets you publish like a human and not perform for an algorithm. Like I said, I've started to feel so much pressure writing and posting anything on social media these days because I feel like if it's not perfect or if it's not good enough, then no one's really going to care. And then it starts to put this extra pressure on me where I'm not even expressing myself anymore. I'm writing for what other people want. And while there's probably a time and place for that and promoting your business and building connections, there still needs to be that in between place where you're not pressured by what other people want, an algorithm or an app is telling you to do. You can just put something out there because you want to. The thing that stands out to me about the digital garden space is that they start to feel a lot more personal when you look around, and it doesn't feel like you're just getting the highlight reel that we often see on social platforms. As someone who's big on systems, I love getting to see how other people think, what works for them, and how they express themselves. Number 3, your thinking becomes a living map and not a final take. One thing you'll notice if you start looking at some of these digital gardens is that a lot of people keep their notes up to date. And that sounds silly because I think a lot of us, especially me when I was first getting into this, kind of think of a note as a specific point in time and you never really go back and change it or alter it. It's just something to jog your memory from a meeting you had or a list of to-dos. But because there's no pressure to get it right the first time, you'll often see people going back and revising certain notes that they deem as evergreen content. I think another benefit of this is that you start to focus more and more on what actually matters. Sure, you can put as much out there as you want, but over the months or even years that you start to maintain your digital garden, certain patterns will start to develop. And it's really interesting to see what lessons or principles you've learned over the years. And you don't just see how you think, but you can also see how your thinking changes over time. Number 4, you actually own your ideas. Steph Ongo, who's the creator of Obsidian, writes about this in his File Over App essay from a few years back. He says, if you want to create digital artifacts that last, they must be files you can control in formats that are easy to retrieve and read. Use tools that give you this freedom. Almost every digital garden you'll see out there is completely built from scratch or self-hosted by the creator. I think this is another huge aspect in a world where we often are just sharing all of our work on platforms that could disappear at any time. Sure, they might not be going anywhere anytime soon, but they have free reign to do whatever they want with your data. So being able to have complete autonomy and ownership over your entire digital garden, in whatever form that looks like, is very empowering, and it gives you this certain sense that you're building something that's going to last. Your digital garden also doesn't have to be super flashy. There are some really cool examples we'll look at later in the video, but they can really be as simple as text on a screen and a folder to organize your notes. It doesn't need to be fancy, it just needs to reflect the way that you think and make sense to you. If you can keep it simple and you own all of those files, you've built a really fortified system of notes that can protect your thinking over the years. Number 5, quantity quietly turns into quality. You've probably heard the phrase quality over quantity. But when I was first starting making videos, I did not care how good they were. I just kept making video after video because I was having so much fun doing it. I think after my first 50 videos, I finally bought a real microphone and I started to take it a little bit more seriously, but none of that really would have mattered if I hadn't put in some of the reps to get better and better at making videos. So now that you've established this low pressure environment to publish, that threshold to put something out there is a lot lower. And to me, it's a lot more motivating and encouraging to put more and more stuff out there. Over time, these rough scraps that you started with start to evolve into essays and videos or more expansive projects. I think the keyword there is quietly evolves. This is something that should be driven solely by your own curiosity and not social or peer pressure. So let's jump into some examples of digital gardens. For the sake of simplicity, I've tried to narrow these down to 3 different styles just to kind of give you a sense of the different websites out there. Obviously, there's going to be lots of examples that don't fit neatly into these different categories, and there might be some that have elements of all 3. I call the first style of digital gardening the writer. This is going to look like a digital studio of different ideas. They might be essays, they might be different notes from your bookmarks, they could be scripts. This is typically good for bloggers, YouTubers, anyone who does a ton of writing. If you maybe have a newsletter and you're constantly going through different drafts, or you just want another place to share whatever you finished in your newsletter, this is where you could host it. These sites also tend to be a little bit more minimal because the emphasis is being put on reading and writing rather than anything too visual. The second style is called the collector. If you've ever heard of the concept of building a second brain, this is going to make a lot of sense to you. These sites typically have a vast amounts of information because this is not just where the author or artist is putting out their own work. This is also where they're storing and collecting all of their bookmarks and anything else that they're saving. This is usually a style taken on by researchers, designers, product folks who are collecting a lot of data and information and need a place to store it. It might feel a little bit like looking at a documentation site where you have almost a table of contents or a map of content. They're more complex because you're not just sharing what you've created, you've also shared the resources or ingredients that helped you get to that point. For example, if you're an engineer, you might be sharing different, snippets of code that have helped you or different templates or workflows that work for you. But you might also have different notes on computer science or data analysis or programming languages or AI or any other topic that fits in that same area. I find a lot of people with ADHD tend to love this style of gardening because it helps you feel like everything has its place. As someone who's tried to build a similar style of website, one word of caution is to make it really easy to share things into your digital garden. Don't bring too many different formats where it's going to be difficult to link between the different notes. What I mean by that is you want to generally have something that's more lightweight, like an actual note of what you're saving. You don't want to always have to go watch through a video or a podcast just to get a 10-second extract of what you're looking for. So be a little bit more intentional with what you're putting in here. So if you're going to save an hour-long podcast, maybe jot a note down with it of the parts that stood out to you. This doesn't just help when you're connecting your notes, but it also makes it more searchable and discoverable when you have actual text to search versus something like a video or podcast. Finally, the second brain idea can also get a little bit overwhelming because you can get to a point where you collect so much information that it's almost overwhelming or too tough to find. So definitely try to stick to a good system, start simple, and don't just add anything in there and try and be intentional. And finally, we move on to the final and probably the most complex but rewarding style of digital gardening I call the architect. About a month ago, a coworker showed me Ryo Liu's concept of digital gardening, which he calls RyOS. Ryo Liu is the head of design at Cursor, which is an agentic IDE. And when he started working at Cursor, he set out to push it to its limits by trying to build and replicate an entire operating system built solely with Cursor. And I will definitely tell you, as someone who has been in the digital gardening world for the last couple of years, this is by far the most impressed I've been when landing on a website. There's so many different Easter eggs when you land on this, and it's such a joy to browse because there's not necessarily a set way to navigate. You can kind of click around wherever. Like if you open up your laptop, you're not necessarily having to click page by page. You can open up multiple apps, you could browse and switch between different tabs and kind of do whatever you want. And that's kind of the concept here with this personal operating system. You can play games here, you can chat with an AI version of Ryo himself, but since then I've started to see a slow trend developing of these personal operating systems. I even saw a designer build his entire portfolio in the style of Windows XP. And it's really cool to see creatives use this thinking space to double as a portfolio or just a playground and even an entire project by itself. As a product designer, this is the form I've chosen to go with because I feel like I can have this balance of working on the website where I can tinker and change the style, add little Easter eggs and different nuggets, but I can also work in the website by actually adding notes and content. And I really love flipping between both. Hopefully, looking at these different examples and styles of digital gardening has given you some ideas on the corner of the internet you'd like to create for yourself. I'll also include some different tools down below that can help you get started, and I'll probably create a separate video on the practical side of building a garden. Where you choose to home your digital garden is up to you, but pick somewhere that's going to feel freeing and will remove any unnecessary pressure. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.